The Guardian Australia has been taking a deep dive into the tertiary education sector and specifically its reliance on international students. Among the reports, academics have accused unis of passing students with almost no English skills.
That's right. Now, the most recent annual reports from each of Australia's top 8 universities shows international students paid the majority of fees. This is despite making up the minority of students. Critics are now saying that the sector is unsustainable. Well, Damien Cahill is the General Secretary of the National Tertiary Education Union. Damien, welcome to the program.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me.
Now, this does seem to be a model that's been in place for quite some time. We have, the fact that these universities charge very high fees for international students. International students are willing to pay for quality education. These fees also help to fund university and their research. It seems like a win-win model.
It is, but there are deep problems within this model, and the main problem is that universities have become over-reliant on the international student fee market, which is highly volatile. So that when there are fluctuations in the international student fee market, we get what we've seen over the last few years, which is mass redundancies in universities. And I think we need to focus on the core of the problem here. So it's not that Australian universities have an international student problem. Australian universities have a funding problem. So successive governments have chosen not to fully invest in the costs of university education and specifically university research. So with university research, it's estimated that there's a funding shortfall of about $5 billion of what research in universities costs and the funding that they get from governments. And so universities have been incentivised over the last 20 years to go and chase this international student market, and they've become over-reliant on it. So this is really what's at the heart of this issue in universities.
I think some people have called it the corporatisation of the tertiary education. That's right. The thing though, when you reduce the foreign student numbers, there would be, of course, a need for increased government funding. There is a danger, though, of being dependent on the government of the day. I mean, we've already seen the previous government, the Liberal government, wanting to promote the STEM courses and therefore raising fees for the humanities courses. And then when we have another government coming in, then the universities would then have to adhere to their political policies as well. Doesn't that just make universities vulnerable to the government of the day and their whims?
Well, they have been vulnerable, but the chief vulnerability is that the universities haven't had stability and certainty of funding. So universities, remember, we have 37 public universities in Australia. They're public institutions. They're charged with doing teaching and research in the public interest, and so it's incumbent on government to fund them properly, and they simply haven't. But you mentioned another thing just when you were talking before, which is the corporatisation of universities, and this is another problem that contributes to these issues. So what we've seen over the last 20 years is the corporatisation of the governance of universities. So we have vice-chancellors who are the leaders of universities, often paid salaries of close to or over $1 million, so much more than the Prime Minister gets. And the boards of universities, which govern the universities, are often dominated by the big corporates, so the mining companies, the big banks, the big financial institutions, and the big four accounting firms. So this brings a corporate focus to universities. And what this means with respect to international students is international students are seen as cash cows. So they're seen as a source of income only, and they're just not provided with the resources they need, international students, to succeed at university, and the staff, our members, aren't provided with the resources they need to properly support international students as well. So we have a funding problem and we have a corporate governance problem in universities.
Okay, so we've seen in the federal budget it includes something like $1.1 billion in tertiary spending over the next 5 years or so. Is that going to be enough when it comes to perhaps closing that gap if the foreign student numbers were to be reduced?
No, it's definitely not. So as I said before, there's at least a $5 billion research gap in funding in Australian universities in terms of the cost of research and the difference between that and what universities get from government. So there needs to be a significant increase in public investment in Australia. The good news is that the government has commissioned a review into higher education and it found that the government needs to fully invest in research in Australian universities. It needs to fix the governance problems in Australian universities, and it needs to increase participation of students who have traditionally been marginalised within universities. So that's all very welcome. It's now up to the government to commit to properly funding universities and make that hard political decision to invest in public universities, which are key to our future. I mean, universities train our nurses, our doctors, our teachers, our scientists, our engineers. They're key to the expansion of the manufacturing sector in Australia, all the research that happens in universities. If the government is committed to that, then they need to make that hard political decision and commit to properly funding universities.